On behalf of the Morningstar team, I'd just like to welcome and thank you for attending our behavioral coaching webinar for advisors. For those that I haven't met, my name is James Lowe and I lead the Morningstar team that partners with advisors, practices and licensees to provide our solutions and services in a manner that not only aligns to best practices that we see from advice businesses across the globe, but importantly for what is unique and makes sense for your firm and your advice process. I know the team are absolutely delighted you can be here. We know and understand what a commitment it is for you to be away from your business and clients in these challenging times we currently face across the country. So we'll do our best to make today as meaningful as possible for you. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. Firstly, just from a disclaimer perspective, this advice in this webinar is general in nature, which means we haven't considered anyone's personal, individual objectives or needs. From in terms of there'll be lots of time for discussion and questions. Please do send them through. I know that there will be CPD points for this session, and there is also a the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. Please do use it, and we'll endeavour to answer questions as we go. Brian does encourage a lot of questions throughout the session, and no doubt he'll be encouraging you to do so as he progresses. I thought on the call today, there's a number of advisors that have at different stages of their journey with Morningstar, some long-standing, some newly formed, and those just embarking. I thought with that in mind, I'd like to frame up today's session. With this being our first webinar of the new financial year, we really wanted to focus it on behavioral coaching best practices for advice advisors. We thought it was important to frame up the structure of what you're hearing today, in particular as it is an incredibly important field of study that's not necessarily understood consistently across Australia. So in addition to investment portfolio risk, which you all know so well, an equally important source of risk is behavioral. This risk results from people, you, your clients, all humans, all of us, acting as their own worst enemy and making unhealthy financial decisions that can potentially reduce long-term wealth. Now, high quality financial advice, as you know, requires taking into account what is both financially necessary, but also what is psychologically possible for your clients. This means as advisors simultaneously dealing effectively with both investment and behavioral risk in a coherent and integrated way. However, the challenge is that behavioral risk cannot be solved with the well-known approaches that are used to reduce investment risk. Behavioral risk requires different kinds of solutions. So what are those solutions? Well, looking back before behavioral finance existed, the smart, thoughtful investors of the world, such as Benjamin Graham, who's the father of value investing, realized that investors often struggled. They didn't struggle because of the maths. They could all do that. It is because as human beings, they realized that investors often acted as their own greatest enemy. And it was the psychology of investing that caused people to falter. In the words of Warren Buffett, investing really is simple. It's just not easy to follow because of that psychology. So in the late 70s and 80s, what we then saw was this identification and cataloging of in the behavioral field of hundreds of different biases that impact individuals. And from this compendium of human errors and frailties, we learned that if advisors and your clients are smart, careful, and understand these biases, they can often be avoided. However, over the last decade or so, we learned that in study after study that while education about these biases is absolutely essential, it is nowhere near sufficient to make a meaningful difference to your clients. So for example, as an advisor, knowing that one of your clients has an overconfidence bias and being able to see this behavior in your clients is just simply not enough. So the behavioral field has moved to advisors not only understanding that your clients may actually not do what they say they're going to do, but how can you as an advisor actually practically help them? And that is where the cutting edge is today and where our focus at Morningstar lies as we strategically partner with advisors in their practice. Helping you as advisors change the way your clients structure investment decisions is where we see the great future of behavioral finance. And really with that background is the purpose of today. Enter Ryan Murphy. Well, Ryan is our global head of decision science, who some of you have got to know well over the last couple of years. And I know he's incredibly excited to be sharing insights with you to better equip you to empower the success of your clients. For those of you that don't know, Ryan was named winner of the US Financial Planning Association 2020 and 2019 awards for his research papers that provided the most outstanding contribution to the betterment of the profession. It is the highest honor awarded by the Journal of Financial Planning, so we're really honored to have Ryan with us today. So good evening, Ryan. I know it is late your time, and I think, as you mentioned before we started, about a year and a half ago, we were dealing with our own fires locally. It sounds like you've got your own issues there, so we do hope your family are all safe and sound, and but really grateful for your time. So with that, I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you for the nice introduction, and thank you all for being here. Yep, it's a nice warm evening, but a little bit smoky. So I'm in the northwest part of the US, and there's plenty of fires in the region. So it keeps things interesting, no doubt. So I would encourage questions throughout, so please feel free to submit questions. There's the button at the bottom there. My friends tell me I'm more interesting if I'm provoked. So with that being said, please feel free to jump in and ask away. So what I want to talk to you about today is some research that we did recently. We call it rules as tools, and trying to understand how heuristics can empower financial success. Here's a general overview of how I want to approach it today. So the first three sections are going to be kind of a general overview of what decision sciences is, and this idea of rationality and bounded rationality, which we have, and how useful they are in trying to help people make good decisions. And then I'll talk a little bit about heuristics and what that means and how we can start to think about that and the research behind that. Then I want to dive deeper into the research that we did in particular. And for this, I want to talk about what financial heuristics decision makers use, what they report using. And then I wanted to dig into our results a little bit more and show which heuristics that people are using tend to be related to good financial outcomes, tend to be related to good financial health, and which heuristics are easy to use. And then I want to highlight the main takeaways. All right, so we'll come back to this, but this is the general structure of what I want to talk about with you all today. So decision sciences. So this is an interdisciplinary undertaking drawing on economics, psychology, and computational methods. I have an academic background, degrees in experimental economics and cognitive psychology, and I bring these areas together to try and understand how people make decisions, especially about risk and money. And there's three different vantage points that we have that we take in the decision and the behavioral sciences that I think are worth calling out. And the first is we imagine what a perfectly rational decision maker would choose. And this is useful as a benchmark. It's a useful starting point and allows us to start to build up models that start to also act as a benchmark that we can judge people's decisions against. But then we need to go deeper because, as you might have known in your interactions with people, they're not always perfectly rational. And we have to start to look at what real people choose and dig further and try and understand why that's the case. And then what I think is one of the most exciting parts of my job isn't just cataloging the kinds of foibles and mistakes people tend to make, but rather start to take what we know about the tendencies people have and use that to help them make better decisions. This is largely what the decision sciences is trying to do. And there's this great metaphor, and that's Picasso on the left there. There are these big, hairy, nasty problems of the real world. And we try and distill them down into these models that can help us understand what really is going on and what drives people. And from these simple models of understanding how people make decisions, build back up and take those and apply those back to the nasty problems that exist. So one of the most useful ideas we have in the decision and behavioral sciences is this idea of rationality. So if you open a textbook on economics or finance, it'll declare very boldly, very confidently, that markets are populated by perfectly utility maximizing decision agents that are rational in their preferences and rational in the choices they make. Their preferences are stable and well-defined. They know and they understand all of their options, and they make optimal trade-offs. And they do all of this to maximize their long-term expectations, right? Now, this is the sort of thing you can teach undergraduates at 8 a.m. for any Econ 101, and they will dutifully nod and say, yep, that sounds right. But really, how many of you do you think this is an accurate model for how most people make decisions? Do you think that's the case? So probably not, I think is a fair statement for this. So what we're doing in the behavioral sciences then is trying to develop a much more human model of how people think and consider trade-offs. Let me pause here for a second and make sure my screen share is right. I worry I might have shared the wrong screen. Hopefully that's okay. Anyway, let me carry on. So the behavioral and the decision sciences. James, do you gonna comment?
Yeah, it's all good, by the way. All the screen.
It's all good?
It's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. So what we've been trying to do in the behavioral and decision sciences is develop a much more human model of how real people think and how they make trade-offs and how they consider their choices. And this isn't to say that we think people are stupid or dumb. It's just that there's limitations. They're limited in how much attention they have and can bring to bear on particular problems. They're limited in the amount of willpower that they can have and use, and willpower is a finite resource. Memory is fallible. People don't always remember things as they think they do and doesn't record perfectly. And even people's ability to try and reason perfectly is limited. There's an inconsistent ability for people to think logically. So obviously we have one brain. This is no surprise, but the emerging consensus that's coming out of the cognitive sciences is that there are these two different systems, two minds operating in there. And this is called the dual systems model of cognition. One of these minds is very effortful, is very slow. This is the part of your brain you engage as you're trying to think carefully about a problem. And the other part of the mind is much more emotive, is much more fast. And this is the part of the mind where answers come that are very intuitive, very simple, very straightforward, and sometimes wrong. Now, lots of different work has been written about this, and probably one of the best summary books in the area is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002, which is somewhat remarkable because he's a psychologist. And he, in his work with Amos Tversky, has changed the field, partially of economics, partially of psychology, and trying to understand how people think. They have developed a catalog of the kinds of heuristics people use and the kinds of mistakes and foibles people fall prey to. And that has led to a general view in the academic field that heuristics can be a bad thing, by and large. But there are counterpoints to this. And some work, this comes from Giga Renzer and others, are looking at the kinds of simple heuristics that people use in these two minds that can help people make smarter decisions. So I think there's a little bit of a tension that comes out of the academic literature of how useful heuristics can be. And I think our research sheds a little bit of light onto what we're trying to do here. All right, so let me tell you about what we mean when we say heuristics, these simple rules of thumb. So a heuristic is a mental shortcut. It's a simple rule of thumb that people use to solve a problem or to make a decision. Now, a heuristic is not optimal, and they don't guarantee finding the best solution. But often heuristics are good enough, and they have the benefit of being faster and easier to use than, say, a full optimization. So you've probably heard that saying, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. This is consistent with this idea of heuristics. Sometimes a simple heuristic that's good enough is better than trying to build a full-on optimization. It's also a way to help avoid decision paralysis. This can be a thing that people fall prey to, where they are overwhelmed by the decision-making process and don't actually know what to do, and so they don't do anything. And this just stops them in their tracks. And that can lead to some pretty bad outcomes. But even worse is this idea called analysis paralysis. That's decision paralysis with lots of effort and thinking through it. So again, decisions don't get made. People make themselves miserable by churning over all the options. Heuristics can help break through that and help people at least make a decision and do something. Now, heuristics have been studied extensively in cognitive psychology and behavioral economics. And seminal research has highlighted the ways in which these heuristics can lead people to make systematic mistakes. These things are called decision biases. And this is the kind of work that allows us to talk about how people can be predictably irrational, the kinds of mistakes people tend to fall prey to be able to identify those. And there are literally hundreds of identified heuristics and biases from the literature. So for example, if you go look at the Wikipedia page on heuristics and biases, there's about 200 to 300 of these things listed. It's a little bit humbling to read through this and look at all the kinds of mistakes that our brains are hardwired to make. One of the best known of these is something called the availability heuristic. Now, the availability heuristic comes from this idea that things that are easy to remember have a bigger effect on our judgments and our decisions. And things that just happen turn out to be much easier to remember. This is the recency bias, and this is just a feature of how human memory works. People tend to overweight recent events when predicting about what's going to happen next. And because of this, people tend to over-extrapolate, and this can lead to all kinds of bad behaviors, especially when it comes to investing. This kind of recency bias can lead people to start to over-extrapolate and then chase returns. And that leads to demonstrably bad outcomes if people fall prey to this particular bias. So in my view, the Heuristics and Biases program, it's brilliant, but it's a little bit pessimistic at the end of the day. because I think many other researchers in the field would argue that simple rules of thumbs can have a useful starting point when thinking and deciding and problem solving. It's not to say that they're better, they're not, but at least it's something that people can do, especially given that they're bounded in the way in which they're rational. And so that was part of the starting point for our research, was thinking about, well, let's take a little bit more of an optimistic view on how heuristics might work and start to think about how heuristics might be useful for people as they make decisions about finances and investing. So these were our research questions. What kind of financial heuristics do people report using when they're thinking about making decisions about money and risk? We also looked at what investors' top-rated financial heuristics were, the ones that they considered to be most important as they're making decisions. Then we got into a little bit more deeply, and we started to look at how the popularity of these different heuristics is related to users' financial health. So for example, are people who have higher financial health also more likely to use particular heuristics? This could give some clues that certain heuristics are more useful for certain people in particular contexts. And then we also asked people which heuristics were rated as easiest to use, because this helps. The more that people have heuristics that are easy and quick, the more likely they are to use them in the moment when it really matters. All right, so what I want to do now is start to dig into the research that we were doing around these questions, looking at what financial decision-making heuristics people used. Now, I'll go through lots of details from our study, but I want to assure you that you can also get a copy of the paper. This will be sent to you in the next couple of weeks, in which you can read all the details, and all of this information is contained therein. So if you don't catch all the details, that's okay. Don't worry about it. There'll be more information that's sent to you in an email in the next couple of weeks. So here's the study design. We did a nationally represented survey of about 800 Americans, and these are people who are over the age of 18 who would be willing to participate in this research. This is a nationally representative sample, so it approximately matches what Americans are like when we start to think about applying and generalizing these results. So we asked people to select and rank heuristics from lists of commonly used financial rules of thumb. And we broke this into 4 different domains: debt management, saving, spending, and investing. Part of the reason is that there's so many different heuristics. If we gave people heuristics across all 4 of these domains, it would probably be overwhelming. So we divided them up into these domains and studied them separately, which gives us a little bit more fidelity in understanding what people are doing. We also measured all of our participants' financial well-being using the US Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's financial well-being scale. This is a standard measure of people's financial health. It's been used extensively in the field, and lots of other studies have used this as well. And it's good in that it gives some idea of how financially healthy a particular client is or person is at that moment. And lastly, we then measured how easy it is for participants to use these particular heuristics. Now, there are a lot of heuristics that are out there. So if you look at the trade press, for example, what are good ways to manage debt? There are a lot of different things that are suggested. So what we did is collected those. We read as much as we could from trade journals, articles that are published on different websites of people who are giving advice or suggestions of here are the kinds of rules, simple heuristics that you should follow when thinking about these things. We did a couple pre-studies to consolidate them down because some of them are basically saying the same thing. And these are the different heuristics that we used, and we covered a lot of them. So these are the ones that all have to deal with debt management. These are the ones that have to deal with people's savings. These are the ones that have to deal with spending. There are a lot of different ones on spending. And these are the ones that have to deal with investing. Some of them are a little bit American-centric. So for example, there's some heuristics in here about 401k plans. This is a retirement savings plan. But I'm reasonably confident these results would generalize to lots of different contexts, including Australia. All right, so these are the research questions we were interested in. What financial heuristics do people report using? Just asking them as they look through these different lists, which one of these jump out of something that they identify using? And then we wanted to ask people not only what they use, but what do they consider to be their top-rated heuristics? What do they consider to be most important as they make decisions? We then wanted to look at the popularity of these different heuristics and then relate that to people's financial health to see if certain heuristics are more closely related to people's financial well-being. And then we also looked at which heuristics are easiest to use. So let me jump right into the results. So these are the top used and the top rated heuristics. So those 2 research questions are really close to each other and the results line up very closely. So let me just show you both results at once. So these are the top used and the top rated heuristics in the 4 domains I was talking about. So for example, people, when they're thinking about debt management, have this rule that says always pay debt in full when possible. This would be in the context probably of credit cards or consumer debt. Make more than minimum payment. Again, that's a credit card kind of rule. And make a payment plan. Make some sort of plan thinking about how to get the debt reduced. And spending, there's some interesting heuristics that jump up. Don't spend more than you can make. Really simple rule, but pretty sensible, it seems. This one I really liked. Make lists for shopping. So notice what that is there is actually a two-mind kind of rule. So remember before I was talking about this dual model of cognition, the slow mind and the fast mind. The slow mind is the one that makes the list before, very methodical, cold, calculating, logical. And then it has the person keep that list. And then in the moment when they're maybe feeling more impulsive, they can rely on that list. So this idea of using a list for shopping and having that curtail some impulsive behavior is a really interesting story when you think about the two models or the two modes of thinking people have. Organizing finances regularly is something that really is a good touch point for people as well. Save as much as you can. Separating saving and spending account, this idea of using mental accounting. I mean, this is demonstrably not rationalizable because money is fungible, but as a way for people to think about this money for this and this money for that, that can be useful for helping people save more. And for investing, start investing early, make sure there's diversification, and make sure that an investment plan aligns with a person's risk tolerances. All right, so these are the top rated heuristics that we're seeing. Now, what I want to do is dive into these heuristics a little bit more and start to look at how they're related to financial health and how automatic they are for people to use. So what we did here is we looked at how frequently these different heuristics are used, and then we correlated that to people's financial health. So if the correlation is positive here, what that indicates is that people who have higher degrees of financial health are more likely to use this particular heuristic. All right. Now that gives us some insight. It doesn't say that using this heuristic causes people to be healthy. We really don't know the causal direction here, but we do know that people who are in a good place from a financial health standpoint are more likely to endorse these particular heuristics. So always pay debt in full. This comes out with a really high correlation. Talking about credit card and being smart about which credit card to use so that there's additional points and benefits that come with it, and avoid borrowing from retirement plans. And this is really, you shouldn't touch your nest egg, and people who follow that advice tend to be healthier. But another thing to point out here is that these correlations are statistically significant and reliable, but they're not massive. They're not like 0.8. And so it's not as if everyone who's financially healthy uses the same kinds of heuristics. So I think that there's a lot of different diversity of heuristics that people tend to be using, which I think is worth remembering, and we'll talk about a little bit later on in the discussion. Spending, these are the ones that are related to financial health. Again, don't spend more than you make, very sensible. Saving up for big purchases, this kind of delay of gratification, make sure that there's enough resources, not using debt to fund spending, and organizing finances regularly. Saving, so this is one of the savings one here that's most strongly correlated to financial health is save at least 10 to 30% of income per month. I think this is a really good heuristic for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's specific. It tells a person how much to save and how often to be saving. And I think that that value comes through in this heuristic. So the people who are using that or claiming to use this heuristic have a much higher correlation with their financial well-being, which I think is great. Emergency fund, that turns out to be very useful as well. And taking advantage of retirement matching from an employer if it's available. Again, investing, looking to make sure investing is lined up with people's risk tolerance, diversification, and starting to invest early. All right. Now, we were able to look at the flip side of this as well. And so we were also able to look at the heuristics that people claim to be using when they had poor financial health. And that's what the negative correlations here indicate. So people who endorsed using, and these being their top-rated heuristics, were more likely to have poor financial health. And again, I know that there's not a causal relationship here, but it gives some insight that these people are in a very different kind of context. So for example, people who say the heuristic, try and find ways to earn extra money, these are people clearly with a cash flow problem. And for these people, they're in pretty dire straits. Payment plans, this is again a kind of debt management for people to claw out of lots of debt, and consolidation of debt is another sort of way for people to deal with what could be too much debt. Spending, so there's this rule of don't spend more than 100 at a time. That tends to be a useful rule for people who aren't in a particularly good place. And so maybe this is a starting point rule to try and help people think about curtailing their spending. Also looking for other sources of cash flow out, thinking of limiting eating out, right? And make a list before shopping. That one also comes up here, but with a rather small negative correlation. Saving, pay yourself first. Now, this, when I first saw it, I was a little surprised because that actually is a pretty sensible heuristic. Why would it have a negative correlation? But when thinking about it more and looking at the rest of the results, I think its problem is that it's too general. It lacks specificity and it's not actionable for a person. And so, yeah, that sounds good, but they don't really know what to do with it. And so this idea of save 10 to 30% of your paycheck every month is much more specific and, as a consequence, actionable. And that, I think, leads to better outcomes. In saving, start out small amounts and work your way up. Again, I think just highlighting where people are, maybe starting in a place that's not so good, and save as much as you can. That one, again, is pretty vague as to what that actually means. Investing, I'm not quite so sure here. Some of these are less clear. So there's this idea of glide paths, which strikes me as reasonably sensible. For people who think investing only in those terms tend not to be in as good of a spot. Perhaps that is just an incidence of a person having a rather ill-informed view of what investing can be and using something that's a little bit off the shelf. And so I think people who get a little bit more into investing may not be using a rule like this. It might be using something else. Rebalancing portfolio is sensible, but I don't know why the negative correlation is there. I wouldn't read too much into it. And this idea of target retirement, we report it there just for completeness, but the correlation is so small. I'm not sure I would make too much out of that. What we did next is we looked at the ease and automaticity related to financial health. So we asked people, of the heuristics that you're using, which of these, how difficult do you find it to use these heuristics and make these kinds of decisions? And then we correlated that to financial health. So people who say it's extremely difficult to make these kinds of decisions, that it's not fluid, that it doesn't come naturally, tend to have a much more negative relationship to their financial health. That was really interesting. And that relationship jumps out most strongly in the domain of savings. And so how automatic is it for you to follow these kinds of rules, a heuristic? The correlation there is really high, 0.59, related to financial health. And I think what this highlights for me is that in the domain of savings, this is where automaticity and ease of implementation is probably one of the most powerful things we can do to help investors succeed. So we know that contribution rate and savings rate is one of the biggest drivers of investor success. And the ways in which we can make this more automatic and easier for clients to do, the better off they're going to be in terms of their financial health. I think that's a really nice finding and is worth building on. So there are these automatic processes that you can sign up for, like take a certain percent out of the paycheck every month or so and put that into an investment account. These kinds of automatic, easy enrollment, fire and forget approaches really help people make better decisions and better outcomes in the long run.
Sorry, Ryan, difficult to jump in. There are a couple of questions that have come through. So thank you for sending those through, and please do keep one of them that's come through is, are you then saying that personal heuristics are important to successful financial health, given there are positive correlations, but not strong, in the 30s instead of 80s? How does an advisor hit on the right heuristic for their clients?
Yeah, well, I will. That's a great question, and one I've thought a lot about. We thought a lot about that when writing the paper and trying to make this actionable. Let me show you a worksheet that we've developed that comes out of this research that we can put in your hands that you can use. And I think that'll help make more concrete a good answer to that question. The short answer is there is no one size fits all. But that's not a very satisfying answer. What I want to do is leave advisors with something that was much more tangible, and I think we're able to do that. So hold me to this. I'm going to try and answer that question within the next 10 minutes or so. And if I do, great. And if I don't, please feel free to fire back and tell me that I haven't done it yet.
Sure. One other question that's come through, and I know there are a lot of advice practices on this call who do a lot of financial well-being programs with corporates. So one of them has asked, how much communication on investments is too much? And how do I encourage my clients to reduce the frequency of viewing that portfolio? Slightly different. I think it's popped in after the investment conversation.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think that we're facing an ever increasing uphill battle. So, I mean, cell phones, even digital, like an Apple Watch, makes it super easy to click and see what the stock price is. And this is a horrible use of digital technology, right? Because the more often people look, the more often they're likely to see losses, right? Because there's just natural fluctuations in the marketplace. And we know people are hypersensitive to losses. This is called loss aversion. And we know that the more often people look, the more likely they are to meddle. And so I think that when you have these kinds of digital interruption devices, that's actually acting contrary to what would be good financial advice, which really is You should take a long-term view. You shouldn't be looking at your portfolio daily. I mean, maybe quarterly at the most frequent, and ideally, if the person has the tolerance, once a year strikes me as reasonable. There's good evidence. There were a couple natural studies that were done in Israel, where different firms were able to change how often they checked in and provided descriptive feedback to their clients and how their portfolios were doing. And they found very clear evidence that communicating about once a year was the most effective in helping their clients stay on track and do what they needed to do to reach their financial goals. So I think that for advisors to help their clients understand that this is a long-term process and checking daily is not going to help them do what they want to do.
Perfect. Good. I'll keep coming through the questions as they come in.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you for the questions. All right. So what I want to get to now is the main takeaways from this particular study and how we've been thinking about this and where we're landing after going through this research. And so there's this idea that comes out of the behavioral and the decision sciences called choice architecture. And the thinking is that choice architecture can be a way to improve people's financial decision-making. Now, a little bit of academic history. When people discovered these kinds of heuristics and biases that people had, the kinds of persistent mistakes, it was initially thought, well, all we need to do is just teach people a little bit better and we can eradicate these kinds of mistakes. If only people knew, about these sorts of things, if they knew a little bit of economics, then they would not make these kinds of mistakes. And it turns out that doesn't work very well. So this idea of training in financial literacy, there's beautiful meta-studies that show that this just doesn't really have the kind of long-term lasting effects that we would like to have for people. And so I think what we're doing now is not giving up, is actually pivoting to say we don't have a magic wand or a magic class that we can give people that's going to make them more rational decision agents. But what we can start to do is think about how we can change the context, change the discussion, and change the choice environment to help imperfect decision makers still make really good decisions. And part of that requires us embracing this idea of this dual model of cognition, recognizing that people are not always perfectly rational decision agents. I mean, if they were perfectly rational, the solution is straightforward. You just give people all the available information, they'll make a giant spreadsheet, optimize, and figure it out. But that's just not how real people do these things. So we need to embrace that there's two sides, two minds here that are at work, and let's try and make sure we design decision contexts to help people make good decisions in spite of these two different and sometimes competing systems. And the mantra that comes out of this line of economics is make it simple, make it easy, make it relevant. And in our research, what we've been thinking about is trying to find the good rules that people use that are simple, that are easy for them to use, that are painless for them to automate. And then starting to think about, well, maybe we could develop tools that could expand this toolbox a little bit. We're not going to try and make people perfectly rational, but maybe we can give them a couple handy heuristics that they can use in the moment that'll help them make better long-term decisions. What we're doing here is we're using their slow minds, so this parts of their minds that are more slow and methodical, more rational, to nudge what their fast minds will do in the moment, and arming them with a particular heuristic, which can help them make those decisions. So one of the big takeaways, I think, from this research is this great quote by George Bernard Shaw: the golden rule is that there are no golden rules. So if you come across one of those articles that says, here's the top 3 heuristics that all successful investors use, I'd be very skeptical, because our results don't show correlations that are that high that would back that kind of claim. Rather, there are a lot of different heuristics that work in a lot of different contexts for different people. So we realizing that, we started to develop, all right, let's see if we can't develop a hands-on worksheet, a process that financial advisors that you could do with your clients. So this is the investor-facing one, and it's 2 pages. You can print it on a single piece of paper, front and back. And the front of it just starts to ask people, let's start to just brainstorm, thinking about what are the top-of-mind rules of thumb that you use when you're thinking about making decisions about your finances. What rules work for you? And just brainstorm about that for a second and write this down. Now, what you're doing is you're engaging their fast brain. You're asking them to start to understand and remember some of the heuristics they use in the moment. And they're going to write some things down. Now, this can be really useful as an insight in the kinds of things that your client has top of mind, but it may not actually be the sort of thing that guides their behavior in the moment. And that was part of what we were thinking about is, okay, so this is where we get the fast brain. Now let's start to think about the slow brain. Let's start to get that part of the brain engaged as well. And this part of this sheet is listed as a grid. It's a matrix that has 4 different columns. Again, these 4 different domains of debt management, spending, savings, and investing. And then we listed, these are the top heuristics that came out of our research. And so after the client has brainstormed a little bit and written down some things that come top of mind, you ask them to read through this list and then to circle some of the things in here that really stand out to them as things they use, and maybe even highlight some things that they don't use yet that they would like to. So this is a really useful starting point for a discussion about how people are thinking about money and where their minds are. So say, for example, you have a client and all of the stuff that they're circling and talking about is in the debt management column. That's really useful to know, right? Because then you can start to say, okay, that's where they're coming from. Let me start to expand their toolbox and talk about good rules for spending, good rules for saving, good rules for investing. That could be a very useful way to start to nudge a client to start to think more broadly about what they can do with their money. So we also have the same worksheet, but it's a much more elaborate design that can be used by advisors. This shows exactly the same matrix, the same table of the different heuristics by the columns, ordered in the same way by the rows, but we've put in here additional talking points. I'm sure that you have your own talking points and we'll come up with better things that we have in here, but at least this is a starting point for keeping the conversation going and developing over time. And again, I think that this is a really useful touch point because it records and can be used as a recording of this process. Here's what we did, here's what we talked about, here's the kinds of rules that you're using in your day-to-day practice now. And this could even be something that you'd use with your clients perhaps every 2 to 3 years to see how their thinking is evolving. If they're starting to use new heuristics as they're developing new life situation, as they're developing more resources, that would be a useful way to keep track of how they're thinking about money and what sorts of things they're doing. So the research that this comes out of, if you're interested, is a white paper we've written that's available free for download. This is the link. And again, as I mentioned before, this will be sent to you in an email in the next couple of weeks. And so you have full access to this and you can share this with your clients if you like. The URL is there too for your reference because you could forward that to clients as well. This is also part of a larger research effort that we have at Morningstar and Morningstar Investment Management called the Investor Success Project. And so this is where we're using lots of different resources. There's a behavioral sciences team I work with extensively. Decision sciences have several people working on projects in this area, where we're taking our best thinking and realizing that people are not perfectly rational decision agents all the time, but we can still build on this and we can help people make better decisions by being better armed to understand how real people make real choices. And so we have a whole host of different research papers that are available, again, free for download. Please feel free to download any of these that you like. I also put my email address there. This is mine, it comes directly to me. Please feel free to send comments, feedback, challenges. I really appreciate it. One of the things that is most useful, it's always nice to hear this is brilliant and we love it. So that's nice. But the most useful emails are the ones that say, this particular, with this kind of client, and I use this kind of heuristic, it works better as a discussion point. So I think you should include that on the worksheet. So I consider these worksheets to be works in progress and ways in which we can improve them with our continued engagement with our advisors over time. So this is what I wanted to cover with you this afternoon. High-level learning objectives. I want to talk a little bit about decision and behavioral sciences and this idea of rationality and heuristics, and then dig into what sorts of heuristics people use and thinking about how it can help people use heuristics to make better long-term decisions. Let me go ahead and pause there. I've tried to make sure I left enough time for lots of question and discussion around this.
Thanks, Ryan. There are a couple of questions that have come through, so may I just sort of kick off with those. I think looking at some of the questions, some are linked to heuristics, but others just general behavioral coaching concepts. So I think relevant for all advisors. Right, the one that's come through here, what are ways to keep, and sorry, probably looking at this question probably links a little bit onto the communication one you mentioned earlier. What are the ways to keep my clients focused on the long-term goals and really just not get caught up in these emotions of the moment, let it be some of the sort of challenges you've mentioned today or any other emotions at the moment that sort of detract from their financial health?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And one of the best things that advisors can do is help remind their clients why they are investing in the first place, right? And helping dissuade them of the idea that they need to watch the market day after day. That actually isn't all that healthy. And they're not there to put together a portfolio that beats the market. In fact, most people in their retirement stage or near retirement have portfolios that are designed not to beat the market, and that's a good thing. The reason people become investors is to reach their long-term financial goals. And that's worth repeating to clients over and over again. And this is a mantra of investing as a long-term process. And what happened in the market last week is not what we need to focus on. Let's focus on long-term plans. Where are you now? What are you doing today repeatedly? And how is that going to get you where you want to go? So I think that it's worth reminding clients of this goal-centric view of investing and helping them start to speak this language. And so I think that one measure of success is when they start to see, here's what this particular market did in the last day. They recognize that that's not really consequential to them in terms of their long-term financial goals. Just getting people out of the mindset of what is the daily activity in the market doesn't matter to them. What matters is the 10-year process that they're on, 20-year process to get to their longer-term financial goals.
One interesting one that's come in over the last 18 months in this sort of COVID era that we've had to endure across the world, are there any sort of behavioral biases or finance sort of errors that have really come to the fore more so than ever before in the last 18 months as a result of the sort of environment we find ourselves in?
Yeah, I think the one for me is the kind of recency bias. So what just happened becomes people's model for what's going to happen next. And so I think that it's worth reminding people that, especially during times of greater stress and uncertainty, people's attention starts to narrow. It's a natural process. It happens because of neurological conditions we have, that attention narrows, and that can lead people to have a very narrow view of what's in front of their attention, right? What they're paying attention to. And I think what financial advisors can do is help people step back and take a much more historic perspective as to what investing is about. And this is not the first episode of market volatility we've had. And in fact, that's what financial advisors can start to talk through, is that this is actually, there's cycles and there's periods of these kinds of volatility, of ups and downs, and that we really shouldn't read too much into what happened in the last year. Really, when we start to look at markets over the last 40 years, that's where we start to develop a much better vantage to understand what investors need to do today to get where they want to go in, say, 20 or 30 years.
And another one that's come through, and again, I think looking at this question, this will be relevant in whatever region as you operate around the globe. Really understanding and knowing your clients, so the goals, their needs, the aspirations, the values of what they're trying to achieve. Do you think the worksheets that you pulled together can be used as an additional tool to demonstrate the know your client rule that advisors really should be operating within?
Yeah, that's great. That's almost like I paid someone to ask that question. That's fabulous. So let me reference one of my other papers. And so there's this paper we did a little while ago called Mining for Goals. And so we were interested in helping people better understand and, importantly, articulate, communicate why they are investing, what they're trying to accomplish. And the crux of that paper is really interesting in that if you ask people off the top of their heads, why are you investing? They often don't know the answer. They might say something, but it's not reliable. And so what we did is in that particular research developed a process, again, a set of worksheets that people can use with their clients to help clients better articulate and understand their own goals, why they're investing and what this really means to them, bringing it to the surface. I mean, part of the reason, again, it's not that people are stupid or dumb, it's just that their minds are focused on the day-to-day minutia, like where's my cell phone, what am I having for lunch, these sorts of things, not what is your overarching goal of 30 years of financial activity. So I think that there's these tools that we can use to nudge people to start to take a different perspective. And I think that clients benefit from this, and advisors can really produce a great deal of value add by walking their clients through this process and helping them better understand themselves. So again, the name of that paper is Mining for Goals, and the link that's shown on the screen now is the Investor Success Project has this paper, and you're welcome to download that and use those sets of worksheets with your own clients.
We got heaps of questions, and a big thank you to everyone. We're going to do our very best to fire through these as much as we can. The impact of media has increased since the GFC, and the level of client loss aversion. What tools do you suggest for combating this, as our emails don't seem to have the same impact? That's obviously from an advisor.
Yeah, I'm going to preface that by answering that I don't know that I had any deep insights to this. And you're right, the media landscape is changing the way in which people are thinking about information and engaging with information, especially with digital technology. I think is changing the way our minds work, for example. I think people's expectations are now in terms of what happened in the last hour, versus if you had talked to people, say, 10 years ago, they might have not been so fixated on what their cell phone just beeped at. So I think that this is really uphill because it is so easy to look at a cell phone and get a little bit of dopamine hit when you get some new information. But I think with all that being said, I think reminding clients that investing is a long-term process. It's not designed to be fun. It shouldn't be like a game, right? And so if you're watching a TV channel that has little red and green numbers scrolling across the bottom and someone jumping around yelling excitedly about what markets are doing or claiming that they can pick stocks, then this is probably not a good activity to focus their attention on. Rather, there should be a long-term plan. It should be relatively set, and it doesn't need a lot of change over time. And so again, encouraging people to put down the cell phones, not have an app that tells them what their portfolio is doing that day. These kinds of things, I think, really helps people not pay attention to the things they shouldn't be paying attention to.
Quick question, yeah, from someone, but I thought it's a super interesting one, and I think it's something that you'll be across the detail on. Has your research separated different demographic groups?
We've looked for that. And so that's one of the natural things we look at, especially in the heuristics work. Are there different ones for men and women, age groups? There doesn't seem to be anything big that jumps out, but there is a pretty clear relationship between the kinds of rules people are using and different life stages and wealth stages they're at. And so you can start to see that emerge from the data. And so I think that when you'll hear people say, what's the best heuristic? I think that's a false question. I think that there are good heuristics for particular clients in a particular situation. And that's part of the reason we developed that worksheet, is so that advisors can work with their clients and develop those bespoke, tailored sets of heuristics that work and really help their clients do what they need to do. So we didn't see massive differences, but there are people early parts who are just trying to get cash flow managed are using different heuristics than people who are closer to retirement and thinking more about decumulation. So that was, I would say, age and wealth were the ones that come through a little bit.
Good. There's another question that's come through, yeah, and knowing your fantastic colleagues you also work with in Chicago, with Sarah and Steve and Sam and crew. I know that some work's been done on a workbook, which I know sits in our toolkit called Simple But Not Easy, which will answer some of this, but I think it's interesting to hear your insights. It says, is there a specific way that gets people to change their heuristics more effectively than others? Example, repetition. Get them to explain it to me as the advisor, reconcile the behavior to the personal statements, get them to write it down. I think aspects of that would be good to sort of touch on, particularly with the work I know we've done in other areas across Morningstar.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of power in habit. And so if people really have particular heuristics that are deeply habituated, it might be hard to nudge them away from that. I think that one thing I would consider is trying to expand the toolbox. And so if you have a client on one of those worksheets as you're getting to know your client, and you start to see that almost all their attention is focused in this narrow area, rather than challenge that and push against that and say, that's actually not so smart, you'd maybe just sort of, refocus their attention on, have you considered this? How about this? And start to, by expanding that toolbox and knowing that attention is a finite resource, they may start to deprioritize certain heuristics or leave those behind. So I think that the idea of being able to give people additional heuristics and rules that they can use and embrace is a really useful way to maybe tamp down ones that they should let go of. But I think trying to get rid of a heuristic in the absence of what the next thing is would be pretty hard.
A really good question, this one, and looking forward to your answer, because you could be a multi-millionaire if you get it right.
Okay.
If you could develop one app to combat the negative behaviors that are driven by the current apps, such as portfolio value, what would be included in that app? So I'm assuming the fact of those apps saying up and down, the market's been down, and the negative behavior of that, what would you do to change that?
Yeah. Well, I've thought about, here's my idea for the app. It's actually, you write it on a sticky note, right? And it's really simple. You write it in very, good black ink. Do you know why you're an investor? Right? What are you trying to achieve? Do you have a good plan to do that? Are you following it? And keep at it. That's it. So there's no app. There's no updates to it. There's no what does the news do? It shouldn't change the news. Do you know what you're doing? The overarching theme is that why do people become investors? To reach their financial goals. And if they know what their goals are and they have a good plan and they're on track and doing what they need to do to stay on track, keep at it, right? So I don't think I would have an app so much as I would just carve that in a small piece of stone and make people carry it around.
Excellent. There's another question that's come through here, which was similar to the one earlier in terms of communication and emails, but it's more of a comment and then getting your opinion. So
Sure.
there's a bit there, so I'm going to try to sort of summarize it. They're finding emails and sending lengthy emails and reports just never get opened and never get read by their clients. So what they found helpful to send Zoom videos explaining documents sent to their clients. They thought this type of interaction provides clients with a better understanding as they learn how the market operates. Question is, do you think this is a good approach or not? Or any sort of concerns you might raise with that one?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that when you see that emails aren't being opened and they're read, right? I think that some businesses have a tendency then to try and send more emails or send longer emails, and that just strikes me as counterproductive. I think this is a domain where less would be more effective. One of the ideas I like most is this idea of just-in-time information. So when is a person having to make these kinds of decisions? And that's why I think heuristics can be very powerful, is because people can carry them with them in their head. And in that moment when they're making a decision, say to set up savings rate, they have this rule that echoes around, be like, wait, save 10 to 30% every month. Okay, am I doing that? And so in that moment, they have a little bit of guidance to help them make a good decision right then and there. And so I think that that's the kind of thing people can carry with them. And that is a useful tool for people as they're making the decisions. I would be skeptical to think that long emails that come in every week or so would provide the same kind of clarity or insight to people. So I think that there's a lot to be said for keep it simple, right? Keep it really easy for people to have and make sure it's relevant, and knowing the kinds of decisions that people have to make in that moment and having the right word or phrase or idea that they have at their disposal can help them make a good choice then and there.
Sure. One comment that's come through, but less than a question, but one that I think it's a really a great comment that's come through in inverted commas. We're all disciplined to our present set of habits. So it's a comment to say that we're all disciplined to that. So I suppose the from your side, Ryan, would be how does one break that to a new habit that actually gets ingrained in to make better, healthier financial decisions?
Yeah, habits are hard to break, exceptionally powerful. And I think that this idea of two minds, I think just arming clients with this idea, and just advisors recognizing that the mind of the client that they're talking to in the office is the cold, cool, rational, calm one. But most of the financial decisions that client's going to make is using a different mind. And so I think that the more that discussion can be enlarged to talk about the two minds at the same time and to bring that metaphor to bear in the discussion is useful. Because I think then people start to recognize a little bit of, I'm a little bit of a stranger to myself, right? So what am I trying to do here? And by being able to reflect on that and then be able to have a couple of heuristics that can save me in the moment, that's a really useful way to guide behavior. And so by thinking, say, look, I know habits are very powerful. I know that I tend to be impulsive. So what are the sorts of things that I can do to break that? And this idea like shopping lists, I love that one. So that's a person developing a new habit to try and curtail another one. And so I think that as we can arm people with these kinds of examples that come out of what they can do to resolve the tension between those two minds is a useful way to try and steer people away. I mean, just telling someone that they have a bad habit is not going to be sufficient. And that's part of what I like about this heuristics, is finding these heuristics that work, is being able to use these that might supplant other heuristics that people have that aren't working so well for them.
We've got another sort of 6 minutes, and just a big thank you, Ryan. Again, you've been fantastic. All these questions coming through. Last question before we close up. Interesting one. How does one deal with clients who get caught up in the motions of refusing to act rationally and almost paralyzed with fear? I'm guessing there are a few things, or I mean, when I say fear, I'm guessing they're referring to sort of market downturns and any other aspects that might prevent them from investing or taking on the financial strategy. But any sort of comments there? I know you've addressed it broadly in some areas already, but any other specific comments you can make?
Yeah. So one of my favorite plots to deal with this, I don't have this unfortunately to show, but imagine this. It shows two different investors and it shows a market downturn. And it shows what their portfolio value is. And one of those investors succumbs to fear and decides to go to cash. And they go to cash and they're going to hold on, and they're going to, of course, realize when the market's back on an upswing, and they're going to buy, right? Because they have the capacity to predict when markets are going to be on an upswing, right? That's dubious by itself. The other person rides it out. They stay the course, they don't sell. And then you look at this thing and how it can play out. And the vast majority of the time, staying the course leads to much better long-term financial outcomes. And I think just by looking at that plot and telling that story and say, yeah, it might make you feel a lot better in that moment to sell, right, and go to cash. But the long-term consequences are dire, and you are not going to get any closer to your long-term financial goals by going to cash. And I think that we're just reminding people. So you have this emotion of fear in the moment. Yes, I understand, but part of what investing is about is reaching these longer-term goals, not meeting those particular emotional spikes that people get, especially from watching market volatility. I think that one of the other things that people can do that just helps tamp that down a little bit is to try and look at market from a broader perspective. Rather than look at what the market has done in the last day, try and see what markets are doing over longer cycles. And we know from the law of averages that these things tend to wash out a little bit and the volatility gets a little bit more mellow. And that can help people understand what the market is doing right now and where they want to go. And so there's lots of ways in which we can visually represent this to try and help people understand the ups and downs of the moment, and then try and put that in the larger context of that's normal, right? We fully expect that to happen, but this is a long-term process.
Thanks, Ryan, and just again from the Morningstar crew and on behalf of all the advice practices we serve, a big thank you for your time. So, look, I think just to close out, there are a couple of questions that have come through asking where do we access these tools, where do we access the worksheets. We will be communicating with you after this, but I'll strongly recommend is to touch base with the team at Service Advisors, and you'll get that link where you can sort of click and engage and get access to these tools and get some insights on them. And they do sit on the Morningstar Managed Portfolio Toolkit. A lot of the work that Ryan has done with his colleagues, and the work that we've done for this session will again be placed there. Just a request for everyone. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see a poll. And I did promise you CPD points, but if you don't respond to the poll, we can't get your CPD points. That is my attempt at a joke. But if you can, we really do value your feedback. A lot of the great initiatives that we have implemented over the last few years have really been driven by the feedback we get from you as advice practices who we serve. So if you could provide your feedback on that. On that poll and how you valued the session, it is super valuable. So we'll be grateful. So look, have a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you are around the country. For those that are in lockdown, my thoughts are with you, and take care of yourself. And Ryan, please take care of yourself and the family with the fires in the US.
Thank you again, everyone, for being here.
Take care. Bye.